Okay, hello, and welcome to day 4 of the Nasher Prize Graduate Symposium. I'm Trey Burns, your host and moderator for this week, and it's wonderful to have you join us today, the final day, as we're delving deep into the works of the 2025 Nasher Prize winner, Otobong Nkanga. So today's session includes a roundtable discussion with our esteemed scholars, followed by a keynote address from Maria Magdalena Campos Pons. So stay tuned for that. But first, I would like to introduce you to our panelists for today's roundtable discussion. And just like that, we have this nice view of everyone together. So joining us are Alarege Berra from the University of Texas at Dallas. We have Veronica Kamai from Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, India. We've got Margaret Nagawa from Emory University and Alphonse Chu from Yale University. And then finally, Bram Groenteman from the University of Amsterdam. So thank you guys for being here. It's been a real privilege to listen to your presentations over the last couple of days. And I've really kind of been eagerly anticipating this moment so that we can all talk together. So to kick off our discussion, I've crafted a few prompts based on your presentations. And additionally, we've gathered some questions from our audience throughout the past couple of days. And we're also keeping an eye on the chat. So feel free to share any thoughts or questions that come up as we're talking, and we'll try to fit them in. And panelists, we kind of talked about this before, but as we're talking, I want you to feel free to respond to the prompts, but also to one another. And hopefully we can cultivate this broader conversation. All right. Okay, great. So with that, let's jump right in. The first kind of prompt I have here is for Alarege. I think you said something to the effect that great art seems to be channeling something. That was I pulled out of your presentation, and I wrote down this sort of amazing phrase that you said, rhythmic metaphysical insights. Which I just love that. I just wanted you to maybe explain that concept a bit more, and maybe what sort of truths that you see in Nkanga's work is channeling that's unique to her.
Yeah, there's that phrase in particular comes from Senghor, and it's part of sort of this. Senghor is kind of sometimes lambasted for turning negritude into like sort of a structured system of analyzing African art, which I mean, like Césaire was not particularly interested in. But I think returning to sort of Senghor trying to find that philosophical truth within African art, there's this really like powerful moment in his discussion. He's particularly talking about a set of, if you've ever seen them, these Congo and Kisi, which are sort of like they're sometimes kind of derisively called fetishes. And he talks about the ways in which there's almost like the grain of the wood kind of echoes a particular motion of spirit in the Congolese worldview, sort of like the river of souls. And he talks about sort of the way that art can kind of not only like latch onto these like very hard to explain or grasp concepts like this metaphysical river of souls, but also kind of like almost amplify the experience of learning about or engaging with a particular metaphysical concept. And I definitely think that I saw that a lot listening to the other presenters, the excellent presentations from my colleagues here, and definitely I could see it in Contained Measures of a Kola Nut, because I mean there's so much that the Kola Nut veneration, and particularly the Kola Nut hospitality ritual, which is kind of expanded into this work of this performance piece by Nkanga, contains about like sort of not only just sort of systems of hospitality, but kind of how relationality works at all. It's a very it's very particular to West Africa. And I mean, and I don't mean this in sort of in the sense that we can't engage with it if we aren't West African or from a West African culture, but in the sense that it's rooted in a very particular philosophy of being and being with others. And I think that this is sort of definitely an example of what Senghor might have called like a rhythmic extrapolation that you see in art.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. I mean, does anybody else have anything to add about this kind of sense of channeling, these kind of things that we're tuning into?
I think it might link us to Alphonse's conversation or discussion about conviviality. I think the idea of relationality and conviviality sort of come together in her work in general. Nkanga encourages that, the audience participation at different levels.
Thank you. Okay, maybe we'll take it to another prompt here. And it's kind of one that I've been mulling around myself. But despite the themes of extraction and exploitation in her work, Nkanga's work also seems to carry a sense of optimism. And maybe that's not the right term. Maybe that isn't even the proper term for this kind of engagement. Does anybody have a better term for what it holds?
I can take that. Thank you so much, Trey, and thank you so much, Laureate and Margaret, for your responses earlier as well. I think optimism is indeed maybe a cautious concept for me, because I think what is so potent about Nkanga's practice and works, which I've kind of seen demonstrated across my fellow colleagues' presentation over the past few days, is really this relational practice of bearing witness, but also creating the space and the temporality from which, after you have borne witness, you do something about it. I mean, she's not didactic about it, she's not pedagogic about it, but the ways in which this kind of availability of multitudes of possible strategy, aesthetics, or otherwise, that comes as a response to this motif of extraction, I think that is something which is very pertinent and prevalent that we see in her work. And there was also another work originally that I wanted to cover in my presentation, which I didn't really have the time, and thus I kind of excised it. In her earlier series with Outerscape, where she kind of created this series of triptychs and diptychs where her figure was looming over a landscape. So it's a photographic series where it was staged such that she's looming over a landscape, ready to manipulate, ready to work the very soils. And this is, of course, a trajectory that I think we see in later work, such as Glimmer Fragments or in Solid Maneuver, especially the performance activations of it, where the kind of manual rhetorics of the hand, of the kind of choreography embodied in labors and mechanisms of extraction also simultaneously constitute the possibility of restoration and putting things back. So this kind of differential motifs, I think, are just very poignant and powerful reminders of, in fact, the kind of potentialities of hope and the potentialities of optimism, instead of something that would some may consider more reductive, as just kind of talk about things will be better. I think the potency of Nkanga's work is to kind of provoke us into thinking, so what can we do to make things better, instead of the kind of truism of, oh, things will improve. But yeah, that's just maybe my interpolation.
No, I thought that was really good. Does anyone want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I also had a similar thought. But what I find interesting, that it's not about this restoration as bringing it back to the way it was, but more about these reparations. What way can we go? And you see this whole rejection of functionalism more to like this relationalism, and everything, all the knowledge is based in the relations between us. And in this way, she is not optimist because she doesn't think it's going to be all right, as Alphonse also said, and Margaret as well, I think. But she's hopeful that we can find something else that will lead us to a place of optimism instead of accepting the optimism already present.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, you know, Alphonse, you said that the tactic of bearing witness. I think you also said in your presentation, resisting amnesia, which I really love that phrase too. And I made this connection to Brahm, where he said that everything is connected and everything is evidence in this work, which I really loved. And I think that takes me to a prompt for you, Brahm. I know you just spoke, but you've highlighted the presence of chords running through Otobong and Nkanga's work and described it, as that sort of connection. So how do you think that sort of larger sense of connection plays a crucial role in understanding her intentions and impact?
I feel like Otobong has the sensibility that everything is connected, and those chords and the threads and those connections that you see are not her weaving them, but just bringing them to light. And in the same way that the dynamics that she's fighting have the selective bringing to light of connections, only making them useful for themselves, she brings to light these connections that are not there yet, connections that have always been there but have been ignored. And in realizing this, her practice is extremely research focused. It's not always said, but every time she makes any work, she goes into extreme lengths to find out every single thing about it, which also makes it for us academics difficult to just interpret things because she already knows what she's doing. We cannot just speculate because, well, there's nothing to speculate about anymore. But she has this awareness of these connections and these sensibilities. And by selecting different things to make visible, she's basically, how to say that, like, it's almost a viewing exercise. She shows these things were not visible before, but I'm making them now. Think about what other things are also left out of the picture. In this way, her connections are everywhere in her work, if that answers your question.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, does that trigger anything for anyone else?
Yeah, so regarding the interpretation of the chords, because we see that it's prominent in almost every part of her works, and especially you look close dive into it, it sort of reminds us of those umbilical cord that connects the mother and the baby, because we know that the babies definitely come from the mother, and that's the kind of thing that I've been looking forward into it. Like when you see Nkanga's work, and especially it shows how like the living and the non-living entity that we see in our work, that's how it's almost very interconnected to one another. And if I have to take it from this sort of take it from this context of present day contemporary society, and then we look into how all this TJ DeMoss and all talks about how environment and all, how it's very much connected to the social, political, and economical realm of current society. So that's what I've been thinking in this case of how the umbilical cord, Nkanga's cord, which is almost like an umbilical cord, connects both the realm of living and as well as the realm of non-living. That's what I've been thinking about. And I don't know if anyone agrees to that, but that's just my idea and put into it.
I love that. Anyone else feel inclined to follow up on that? Margaret, could you possibly elaborate on the sensuous effects in Nkanga's work that you mentioned, and how these elements kind of contribute to a more profound sort of aesthetic experience of her work and might be lost to somebody who's seeing this work through documentation?
Thank you, Trey. With the sensuous, I was looking at how we experience pleasure or even recognize our own identity or that of another being, another human, but not only limited to human. And that would be through the senses. Mostly in the particular work I was looking at, the Baggage 1972.2007 was sight, hearing, and touch. those senses were coming to the fore, or at least Nkanga was pointing those out to us and experiencing them herself. And what we see in the performance, at least on that one evening at Diapo, is the three-part lecture performance. To start with is the sharing of the envelopes with the sand in them. And that kind of draws into the conviviality that Alphonse was talking about, and the relation building across individuals who are meeting probably for the first time in that room. And by giving them this little gift, I would say, is to creating something that goes beyond having met in a space to watch an artist do a performance. It creates a bond that lasts beyond that space. So I look at that as a connection that comes from hand-to-hand sharing, eye-to-eye seeing one another, recognizing the presence of another individual, and actually going beyond the performance itself. So it looks into ideas of futurity, and we decide how we create that future.
It's strong. Anybody else have anything they would like to contribute about speaking in terms of the sensuous?
Yeah, I can also maybe elaborate with my particular interpretation. I mean, thank you so much, Margaret and Trey. And I think for me, what is also particularly striking, if we are to kind of deploy the mode of the sensuous, is exactly to kind of examine the mode of relationality and exchange. So beyond even convivial encounters and kind of blurring the space between a formal performance, some of her works, or some of her installation works, for example, with the landization series that I talked about in my presentation, were there explicitly to create space. And they were to create charged, emotionally charged, discursively charged, but also sensuously charged space out of those installations through the formation of this organic archive, this kind of storytelling, moments of true conversation that goes beyond, I would say, what Nkanga as an artist or as a moderator, facilitator, or convener could ostensibly orchestrate. And I think this kind of encounters really problematizes and allows for a kind of more complex and less complicit forms of entanglement to arise between audience members who are not value neutral. They come bearing their own subjectivities with the kind of inherent subjectivities that Nkanga activates, but also otherwise leave to their own devices in her usage of certain materials and in her invitations of other bodies to collude and collaborate. And I think in a way, it really contributes to this sensuous matrix that goes beyond the kind of specific sensorial dimension that we see in maybe the material of her work, of her installation, but really into kind of examining the relationship of bodies to bodies in space to space. Yeah.
Love that too. You guys are so smart. Well, maybe those bodies to bodies is a good transition to talk about the forms of the disembodied in her tapestries. The torsos without heads and these groupings of arms pulling together, and they reflect ideas, I think, of pretty obviously of labor. But how do you feel like kind of operate in the historical context of a tapestry as a medium?
I think definitely there's a particularly interesting. I mean, I had an odd encounter, sort of like with one where at the moment I was viewing it. I had just finished reading about sort of another Nigerian disembodied body, which was like sort of these famous Yoruba terracotta with like sort of the severed arms, and it's not necessarily that there's like a direct linkage between them, but I feel like there's almost this sense that like that there's like she draws from, I think it's interesting the ways in which she sort of uses African imagery, because it's never particularly, it's not direct in the ways we've come to expect of African artists. It's always kind of circuitous, and I don't mean to say that she's trying to sort of hide Africanity, but like it's almost like it comes out in a way such that it's both globalized and like really deeply local simultaneously. And I felt that sort of like with the encounter with tapestry, and I think particularly with tapestry as an art form, because I mean there is sort of like this very long history of textile art in West Africa. But sort of like the tapestry as we're familiar with it is a colonial product, right? It doesn't like sort of, it doesn't come into, particularly into Nigeria. You know, you have sort of these big weaveries that use sort of Igbo textile artists, almost always women, and then sort of like retrain them for the process of producing textile arts in sort of like the Western mold. And it's interesting to see sort of like an echo of West Africa in sort of the processes that you use to create, you know, I don't want to say Western academic art, and it's sort of another example of almost like a in form, almost like that sort of that circuitous reconnection, and maybe even sort of both global and like really deeply local at like aspect in her art.
I think one way maybe to go from what Ellery is speaking about, what I was also really taken by was the kind of monumentality that several of those tapestry works kind of take form. So, for example, for tapestry that was part of the Unearthed series that were staged at Kunsthaus Bregenz, those are huge pieces. Like those are huge. And I think for me, maybe what was also being triggered was, of course, going beyond specific visuality of scale, but is to also kind of think of how tapestries were, in a way, this kind of pedagogical tools, almost with certain kind of ecclesiastical or, you know, kind of classical bent in talking about certain historical narratives within the context of Western art history and material culture. And I think for me, kind of examining the motifs of the hands, the arms, the kind of these disembodied organs and apparatuses of the body really also triggers a kind of almost diagrammatic relationality, where, you know, there's this kind of creation of the understanding of a certain kind of dynamic between those specific body parts and the mechanism of extraction, imposition of certain kind of coloniality and violence towards landscape, but also other bodies that I thought were especially interesting for me to just kind of examine, in fact, the arms, the hands, the legs as the very first interface into processes of mechanization and industrialization. But yeah, those are also maybe specific interpretive frameworks that I have that, you know, I would love to hear what, you know, everyone else thinks.
Yeah, a thought about what you mentioned about the actual scale of the works, because if you go to any big Western European museum and you go through these tapestry collections, they're kind of the same size, but they're made in such a different way. They value the craft so much, as in it needs to be done as well as possible, but they also need to be as naturalistic enough to kind of disappear into the background. And they were, in a way, as you said, pedagogical tools. They were there to show histories and morality and any type of agenda they wanted to display. But there were also very practical things. They were kept by people in these big houses that were cold, that were noisy, to dampen the sound, keep warmth in. But they also had to disappear. Basically, they were decor. And in the way that Otobong is using these and just using her own iconography, her own motifs, and showing these, she's like unapologetically present. She's bringing it back basically to her own work. She's not trying to blend in at all. She's saying, here we are. And these are the heritage of the fabrics, of the craft, of the maker itself. And she's just bringing the handiwork back into the work and bringing the artist back into the work. And I think that's why it seems so immense, even though they're basically the same size as we're used to, just because we're not used to seeing it in this manner.
I think Nkanga also brings together two different art forms. For me, you have the textile art, but you also have the thinking about a fragment in terms of sculpture. So even if it's a two-dimensional work, thinking of the fragment sculpturally, and this is so characteristic of how she works. She layers textual and visual and also three-dimensional, and sound. Is a lot going on in the work, even if it's implied. And I think this is what we are getting in the tapestries. We're getting sort of pointers to other areas of art and art history. If we're thinking about the fragment, we cannot think about it in isolation. We have to think about it in what is it a fragment of? In that way, we have to build the full picture. We're compelled to do that, to go backwards, to go into the past in order to sort of see what she's talking about more fully.
Yeah, you're right. It's so sculptural. Also, if you look at these close-ups of all these works, any tapestry, even the small ones, the amount of the differences in textures, in thickness, in light effect. She's almost like challenging these rules that we have in Western European art, where you're not allowed to touch anything. You're really supposed to look at it, but she has such a sensory approach that you kind of want to go in them. You want to use them as a blanket. You want to climb on them. And she's really challenging everything we know about these works. And I feel like every single one of her installations does that.
To your point, Bram, about sort of like the didactic element of like the European use of tapestries, I think there's sort of an interesting parallel there, like sort of with the African use of textiles. And I think particularly I would like to sort of stick to Ibibio use of textiles. I mean, particularly, and I mean, they're not sort of like directly metaphorical or representational as you might see in sort of like I don't know, like a Flemish, like one of those big like allegory tapestries, right? Which are beautiful. I mean, I love them, but like I mean, it's literally sort of in the ways in which sort of like the raffia palm fiber, like how they knot together, like sort of contains meaning. And I mean, thinking about connection, in a way, there's like like it almost sort of forces you to like look into the fabric itself to get at the sort of the lesson or that it's trying to impart, or even if it's not necessarily a lesson, or like the message of it, if we want to put it that way. And this is kind of a side note, but to sort of like the textuality, the texture of, and like almost like, you know, you really want to go out and grab these textiles. I haven't had the pleasure of seeing one in person, but I mean, even through sort of the computer screen, you can feel it. There's this really interesting note about Nok textiles. I mean, because we don't, like, you know, textiles, of course, famously don't survive very long in archaeological settings. But you have these, you know, the very famous, like the Nok culture on the Jos Plateau in Nigeria. And like they're even like, you can see sort of the imprint of woven textiles on sort of these terracotta people, which is interesting because you get almost like this negative textile, right? Like it's almost like they're like the like where it once was. And I mean, there's a sense in which I feel like her use of an encounter with the textile as material sort of draws on this much larger, like, I don't even want to say folk tradition, because but sort of indigenous tradition of working with textile, even when, you know, of course the materials are different, and the actual the actual product is one that I think we would call broadly Western in orientation.
Yeah, talking of that, it kind of reminds me of Yinka Shonibari's work, if anyone's familiar with that, with his use of Ankara prints in the batik motif. Because when you see his multi-dimensionality works, like especially the Fragonard, the reinterpretation of the Fragonard, you see it, especially like particularly as a student coming from post-colonial nation, every time you read something, you always have to link with that idea of post-coloniality, all this decolonization. I think Nkanga's work also kind of portrayed that kind of imagery like we see in Nkanga Shinibare's work. It's not a sort of challenges, but it's a sort of taking on and then reinterpreting it. But at the same time, it's also kind of a defined opposition towards what's happening, what is going to be perceived and what it's not going to be. And plus, especially all these works, as we know that it's mostly in big museums, which are housed in first world nations, that kind of post-colonial position comes in. And then at the same time, you also have to not look back and then not just think about it, but you also have to look forward at the same time and be at the present moment. And then you still have to ask it, why, what does that mean? Because Nkanga Shinibare's work also have bodies mutilated with heads missing and stuff like that. Because what you think is that it's not a single unified whole, especially in Nkanga's work. And it's not just pertaining to tapestry, but also her watercolor paintings and drawings, etc. So what question can we ask is, because that body itself is not a single unified whole. So the thing is, what, by whom, for whom, and what cause does it entail to produce this kind of work? So that's a question that she has been thinking about, which is according to me. But also, it's like this kind of this ideas that by whom is it going to be produced, because the bodies itself are mutilated, and for whom it is going to be produced. That's it. That's what I've been thinking about. And I'm sorry, I read everything almost from a post-colonial point of view, and I'm very sorry for that. But that's just my ideas, because we have to know by, at the end of the day, what, to whom the larger audiences it's going to be addressed. That's the thing. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. No, that was great. I don't want to cut off this flow. This seems to be going really well. Does anybody else have anything they want to? Okay. I think that's a good transition to this question that I have here. It's sort of been glowing. There's been significant discussions regarding the use of the term neo-colonial, which is a word that can be used to describe so much happening in the world right now. But in describing Otobong and Nkanga's practice or subject matter, could we delve deeper into this term for our audience, exploring its meanings and the reasons it's considered appropriate in this context, and what aspects of Nkanga's work resonate with the concept of neocolonialism, and how does this term help us better understand what it is that she's addressing in her work?
I can take that. I think what is also particularly fascinating, and I guess the relevance of the neocolonial as an analytical framework, I think to a certain extent beyond the specific representational modalities that Nkanga deploys in her work, I think so much of it also really embedded in the kind of contemporary economies and networks of circulation that those work and herself as a cultural practitioner circulates within, where, you know, there's this kind of maybe not so much autofiction, but there's this kind of biographical trajectory that that accompanies many artists and other practitioners within the diaspora, whether you're African diaspora, Asian diaspora, South American diaspora, where there's always this idea of emerging from your homeland to set or lay roots within the context of a colonial center or colonial metropole, and then to kind of interrogate that specific relationality that both problematizes the kind of existing colonial history, but also in a way forcing the recentering of the colonial perspective, because that is where the infrastructure is. And I think that in the case of Nkanga's practice, it is handled in a very elegant, but also in a very ambivalent way, which I think is kind of part and parcel of the work of cultural practitioner in this time and moment, where, you know, you can't talk about it unless you talk about it. You can't talk about something that you don't talk about because no one else knows what there is to talk about. So, you know, there's this kind of varying degrees of complexity in positioning. And I think what I find particularly great is also, for example, the kind of trajectory that Nkanga's work has also been flowing that, say, eastward. For example, land realizations were staged in 2016 in two places, one in Beirut and one's in Shanghai. And then in 2020, I believe, it went to the Dhaka Art Summit in Bangladesh. So I think, this kind of continual establishment of the kind of post-colonial in that geopolitical way, not so much maybe discursively or culturally, but the kind of spreading of those particular roots and the kind of multiplying of different voices and different audiencehood, I think that is maybe one way to kind of grapple with neocoloniality of the work and the practice of working. I would say that, yeah, I mean, she does her homework and her research so extensively that it is actually quite amazing, as Brown, kind of mentioned in an offhand comment. Like, it's very, very clear because she made sure that she goes back to her sources, and there's a certain rigor that is embedded within her research. And I think this kind of continual interrogation into not just the intellectual trajectory, but also the kind of knowledge production, the apparatuses of knowledge production in the context of predominantly Western, predominantly global North cultural institution that is kind of built off of extraction. I think it raises some interesting questions for us to all collectively ponder, because it goes also beyond the scope of her work and her body. It is talking about the infrastructure of existing and disseminating culture. And I think, yeah, this is maybe a kind of point that we need to be actively and constantly grappling with outside of the representational politics embedded within specific works, because it is about the conditions within which cultural, historical, social dynamics are reproduced and facilitated through material and visual culture.
Yeah, I think that's just like a very minor addition to Alphonse's excellent point. I think there's also a way in which of course, there's the very literal sort of like you see sort of systems of domination and exploitation at work, and the very, like, I guess in that sense, it's the very traditional sort of Kwame Nkrumah definition of neo-colonial like practice. But there's also like kind of like the Fanonian edge to it as well, because it's like psychic work, right? Too. I mean, I'm thinking of Carved to Flow, the soap exhibition in particular, because it is about sort of colonial enterprise. I mean, she's doing like sort of the soap towers that you would see in like Aleppo or in Palestine, with using all these soaps from all these formerly colonized parts of the world. But I mean, also it talks about like health and care, right? And sort of and the ways in which we sort of take care of ourselves and others, right? And I think sort of trying to do that work in the wake of like sort of the psychological ruin that Fanon talks about very deep. In a way, there's a psychological dimension to that work that it's kind of like, I guess, sort of like the other neo-colonialism, right? Like the way in which and I think Alphonse mentioned it as well, there's almost like an epistemic violence done to our own systems of self-knowledge. That you have to recover. And I mean, I mean, I don't want to sort of enclose the question. But I do wonder like really deeply about in what way does this sort of, are they like sort of incommensurate? Like, I mean, because they are like the sort of that kind of psychic work of neocolonialism is an outgrowth of the sort of the economic and political subjugation, but I don't want to treat it just like an epiphenomenon, right? Like, I think it's sort of, it has like a weight and a materiality all its own. And I feel like that's definitely something she's trying to grapple with as well. I'm sorry, that was a bit of a ramble, but.
Oh, that's what this is. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, just in addition to, like, especially when you talk about neocolonialism, and then we turn to the global south and the other global south, Latin America and African nations, as well as Southeast Asian, which is almost forgotten. I think that's what the ecological Marxist Ramachandra Guha calls it, environmentalism of the poor. That's what I've been trying to add, because, yeah, like Alphonse and said also, like, it's not just the knowledge system and all that has been colonized, but I think it's sort of particularly like how like our bodies itself also has been exploited beyond beyond measure is that it's not being able to reconstruct it. And then, especially if you look from a very political point of view, you have to see that the large foreign multinational companies, how it has been doing, and then how it has been terribly lashing, and then almost demolishing every environmental aspect, every anything that comes in the way. Like there are no terms and conditions like to describe how non-ethical their works are. That's what I've been trying to say. And I'm sorry, I'm definitely zoning out or something like that. But if I go back to this book, it's by this really interesting ecological sociologist called Amita Bhaviskar. She writes this book, In the Valley of the River. So that's something which has been done in India, which is against a dam project in Narmada Valley, which is in Madhya Pradesh. So she traces the Adivasi community, which is one of the minorities in India who had suffered the outcomes of caste systems for over centuries. So that's why she has been doing it. And in 1946, there's this implementation of this dam called Sarva Sarovar Dam, which totally demolished the forest area where this Adivasis community were living. And then it's in India term, it's called Navak, which means encroachment of forest areas. So that happened in India after post 1947, because India achieved independence in the year 1947, and so that's another form of colonialism. I think that the state itself, the government itself, has been implementing it, and I think it's kind of visible if we look into Nkanga's work as well, especially the mining of the materials. And for me, it's very interesting, when you look into her cartography, because cartography itself is a colonial invention. If you look into that, and you see in almost piece of her work, she either stands beneath the maps, or the maps are always hung in front of her. So that's kind of the work that has been looking into it. And then I think that's what rightly sums up by Ramachandra Guha when he says that the activist that has been doing right now it's called environmentalism of the poor. So, thank you.
I wanted to quickly add a tiny little bit. I know this is really fertile ground. I was also recently rereading Saidiya Hartman and thinking about the modalities of course, critical fabulation that we see as kind of this embodied processes and engagement that she does, which we also encounter, for example, in her poetry. She does not just work in explicitly visual modes. She also works in with text a fair bit. And I'm kind of wanting to also maybe reverting, for example, to the specific work of, say, Reflections of the Raw Green Crown, where it took on this explicit persona that was kind of examining the role of the extraction of copper and through the malachite, or and how, of course, it formed the kind of church steeples in Berlin. And those kind of filling in the gaps, kind of filling in archival absences with accounts, even though they are fabulated by nature. I thought those are very, very specific tactics and strategies, artistic strategies to combat, in fact, omissions that are deliberate and violent. And I think kind of drawing from that, what is also necessary to acknowledge is that Nkanga is a single artist working within a landscape that is historically hostile, actively hostile to not just to people of color, to women, to many members of any kind of marginal or marginalized communities and identities that faces this forms of violence. So I think what are interesting lessons is to also consider, for example, what are the complicities that have been forced so that participation could even be remotely a possibility. I think that is one of the fundamental seditiousness and kind of insidiousness of the neo-colonial condition is that coloniality never really became neo-coloniality. It just kind of receded into the background, into the context. I think as Ellery pointed out, the many territories that used to be under specific forms of colonial administration are still under colonial occupation, either in name or in infrastructure or in economic networks. And I think those are particularly poignant and urgent points to contemplate. Yeah.
No, definitely. I definitely think you're right. I want to make sure we can get some audience questions in here. So I think what you said kind of segues into this one. This is from Noir Ismail. Are there African ways to think about soil and indigenous belongings or indignity without falling into the trap of blood and soil that the presenters discussed? We got a smart audience.
Yeah, I can go first on this one. There's this, and I think this question's a little bit more general, so the answer can be a little bit more general. But there's this really influential notion of the first comer, late comer distinction in both West and Central Africa. Really, on anywhere, it's like it seems very old, and it travels through the Bantu expansion out from West Africa into Central and then East Central Africa. And the core concept is sort of like a principle of precedence in which first comers to a territory have like a particular prestige and legitimacy in later like intergroup relations, as well as like these interactions with the spiritual domain accessed in that territory. So it's like there's a way in which sort of first comers, like the autochthons of the land, right, it's retained status of the owners of the land, while like subsequent arrivals to the area, like latecomers or newcomers, have to acknowledge and take into account in defining their status in like, you know, the hierarchy of precedent. And I mean, it's interesting because there's like, I mean, obviously, you know, there's the dominant precedents, like the precedence narrative, like kind of acknowledges this tension between sort of like wanting claim, like sort of how people can come to a place and then sort of develop these claims to indigeneity that we see. I mean, that's sort of like the story of the United States, but like there's a way in which like it sort of like it acknowledges these tensions, and like because only rarely do like the standard claims of latecomers that like the first comers, and I mean this is also definitely like super true in Nigeria, simply dispersed upon like the arrival of new settlers leaving like an empty land, right? It's never been sort of like historically valid, but more often like, you know, the politically and numerically dominant group has to acknowledge these first comers who continue to sort of to sort of like they assign them ritual power and in a way that's like sort of a distinct, and I think almost Geertzian in like the Clifford Geertz sense, where there's like a like ritual sort of maintains its own power separate from the power of politics. And I mean, it's curious because I mean, there was a point I think in Alphonse's presentation early on where she says she doesn't want to go into sort of like that in like the questioner said, sort of like this blood and soil discussion. But I mean, I feel like there's a very interesting set of relationships to land and being sort of from a place and rooted in a place that aren't like, and not to be like too Heideggerian, but like being with a place that don't necessarily like fall into that trap. But again, like the questioner said, I think you would have to look inside Africa itself to sort of begin forming an African way to think past this kind of this sort of this really like dark sort of Western engagement with like being of and from the soil of a place.
I have a very quick addition to Ellery's excellent point where, I mean, I do not have the expertise to talk about different African epistemic frameworks and possibilities of talking about soil. But what I do want to bring into question is kind of to consider soil itself as a complex, as an assemblage, because there's no such thing in a way as soil. It is, you know, this kind of complex mixture of different substances that exist on the ground. Underneath the ground is the ground. And I think there is something that's very, very important to kind of consider, especially now on the brink of the climate crisis, or rather in the thick of the climate crisis, where soil is very much embedded within agricultural networks, be they colonial, be they industrial, or be they indigenous-led farming practices. And to kind of think of the ontology of the soil beyond the kind of more metaphysical understandings of land, territoriality, and the kind of colonial subjugation of that specific form of spatial modality, I think it is also maybe just worth keeping in mind, you know, the fact that soil exists as, you know, a class of physical media that kind of constitute the bulk of what life could allow for, you know, be they botanical, be they fauna or otherwise. So kind of thinking about the contemporary practices of that say plantation models, which are very much still present in parts of the Pantropics, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in South America, Central America too. Soil is being depleted at an incredible rate. We are destroying the very substrate from which, we basically grow our food and stand on. And I think that is maybe a slightly more scientific positioning, but I think, it is also needed in complement to what Ellery has pointed out as that kind of different epistemic and social models of the soil.
Thank you. So I'll bring up another question from the audience. This one's from Kirsten. And she says, I'm interested in how the presenters discovered Nkanga's work and what the initial connection was. If it's as simple as having been introduced to her at school, that's fine. I'm just curious as to what branch for practice drew them in and motivated them to write their papers. I think that might be nice for everybody to take on.
Well, mine is not that interesting, but I can expand on it a little. My first encounter with her work was very serendipitous because there's one of her big European representations is in Amsterdam, very close to my house. And I just walked by it once, saw work in the window, looked her up, kind of forgot about her, and then encountered her again at the Venice Biennale, and then was drawn in by this, what we've already discussed, is this very sensuous, these tapestries, basically. After which I just kind of kept following her, saw the call for papers, and then expanded on a thought I already had. And I think it's that simple usually, just bringing about all these connections that are already there, like we discussed a couple of times already today.
My story is also not particularly interesting. I saw a copy of her catalog for, I think, Luster and Looker, and it's such a beautiful book. It's so beautiful. Like, it is heavy enough to kill a small child with, but it is so beautiful, and it's a item that, as a grad student, I definitely cannot afford, but, which I have kind of been monopolizing from the university library for almost a year now. And I think it is kind of those kind of encounters, with the flatness of the image surrounded by text that kind of prompted me to look for, more information about her practice and kind of examining the trans-regional and transnational networks that she constitute in problematizing, I think, specific notions of even, the contiguity and the heterogeneity of the African continent. Just, there are multiple Africas that she traverses and questions. And I think it is, maybe just one of those points that marked my interest, or just like, she cool. She very cool. Yeah.
Nice.
Yes, she is really cool. I first encountered her work in 2005 at the Hayward Gallery in London in the exhibition Africa Remix that was curated by Simon Jamy. And that was photography. I was drawn to her work because it really spoke to me. The green, it was photographs of landscapes, and there was a construction site. You could not be sure if it was going up or down. So it was sort of a ruin in a certain way. I was drawn to it, mostly because it was a landscape that seemed familiar to me. And I sort of kept her in my mind and encountered her work in different fora, mostly online, the performance, the poetry. And I personally like the merging of different media. And that's some of the artists I examine for my research do that. So I kept her in my world. And as I was still doing my coursework with my professor, Dr. Lee, in a course on belatedness, I looked at that work and examined it for that class. And when this call came up, I was actually, Dr. Lisa Lee pointed out, oh, the Nasher Prize call for papers is out. And I looked at it and I said, okay, let's give it a shot. Let's see how we can push this paper. So that's the origin of my presentation.
Yeah, I feel like mine is a little embarrassing now in light of all these excellent answers. I'm not actually like by training. I'm not even an art historian. I'm just sort of an Africanist. But so when I came across it, I was actually looking for a certain Nkanga in a Congolese, like a kingdom of Congo in what was pre-colonial Angola, like a name in a king list, and like it sort of just also came up on on JSTOR as I was looking. But then I was really struck by, and I believe it actually was tapestries, you know, where it was, and I was really struck by sort of even these like this photographic representation of these tapestries. And I will say at that moment, like I just was like, oh, this is really cool. And then like went back to what I was doing. But like I sort of, it like planted a seed. And I later had an encounter where her name did come up like as herself in a book, in a separate book, a discussion of sort of recent art. I think it may have been a compendium of some kind. And then that was like my real sort of encounter with Otobong and Nkanga. But I do think like in retrospect, it is cool that sort of like the way I found her was sort of rooted in the pre-colonial past. I mean, it's not in sort of like a very purposeful way, but it's a little embarrassing, but I think about it fondly.
I guess I have the most boring story. I was introduced to art only after 2018, so I never had that visual art background. But I encountered her through her poetry, which is the first thing. And then comes later when I was researching on diasporic artists. And then that's it. I actually don't know how I began liking her works or whether I like started looking deep into her works. But then I later on decided to check her Instagram account, and that's like the story behind it. Yeah, I think.
Thank you. That's great. I have one more. I have another question here that just came in that I think is kind of sort of an interesting one. It's in an interview for Moose Magazine. Nkanga talks about how performance is a part of everyday life in Nigeria, and that you have to be totally aware and awake to meet the energy there. Do you feel that she asks the same of her audience? And if so, can you give examples of how she achieves that? Might be a nice one for Margaret to answer.
I think I love her pointing out that everyday life is actually performance, because one wakes up in the morning and puts on this mask. Like, what am I going to be today? Is it the same person that I was tomorrow? What do I wear today? So those questions are actually performative, not in a very artistic way, but in showing up. Who am I to whoever I will encounter this morning or afternoon or night? So that I love that. And going onto the street and seeing the elegant clothes and all that, it's like, oh wow, I want to be that tomorrow. So it's wonderful, and I think it comes out in some of her work, particularly the baggage that I'm looking at. It's like you cannot just enter a room in the dark and sit. You have to interact with the artist. So you have to show up. And she shows us there that there's a relationship that we must build by encountering another human being or another being, and also by being present. I think that's critical when we are even thinking about the post-colonial lens. How do we show up? Are we thinking of ourselves as still subject to somebody else's power? Are we thinking of ourselves as having power over another group of people? I think that performance of confidently existing in the world or showing up in a particular light, in a particular form, is critical. And she prompts us to do that. I think she does.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. Anyone else have something? Okay, cool. I have another question I wanted to prompt to Veronica and all of you, really, but I'm curious about how we can differentiate between sort of these traditional notions of what ecology is and environment and these more broader and expansive interpretations that Otobong and Nkanga brings to this concept. And like, in what ways does her work extend or challenge conventional ecological narratives, and how does her approach to ecology incorporate and reflect upon cultural, social, and historical dimensions, in addition to environmental concerns?
Yeah, starting with it, if we look deep into it, I think every work of art is very environmental conscious, if everyone agrees or not, but that's according to me. It's very environmental conscious. And A, that's it. B is what is most interesting as her points of contact. That's what I called it about. Her points of contact, which is not just particularly sitting in one single space and then asking what to do this or what not to do, but it's just points of contact, that interconnections between various dimensions, various methodologies of studies as well. And then it's not just that she's not just environmentally conscious, but at the same time she's also politically, socially, and economically conscious, because that's the thing you can never you can never disassociate environmentalism with. That's one of the most important things in her work. And second, C, it's the idea that how she kind of represents this environmental structure in a very complicit manner that's not just visibly shown, but it's also very, very much embedded in her work in very small, minor details. That's the thing that is one of the main concerns, like especially if you look into her weight of the scars and how the extractivism policy. That's very that's another thing. And then you have this Delta Stories, which is that 18 series of watercolor paintings that she done, because I think Nkanga is very much known for her tapestry and sculpture, and the thing that is always sort of left behind is the drawings and the little sketches and drawings that she does, and the paintings, watercolor paintings. So if you look closely into that, you can find how ecologically conscious it is in its presentation, in its diagrams and its drawings, because you can see the rendering of trees in its very specific positions. Because if you talk about how situated it is within that space, that's how she does it. That's it. Then from that one, I think it's just like how this entire discourse of environmentalism comes up, and then you have various kinds of various kinds of artists who are definitely working towards all this ecological concern. And then the main thing is like they just don't want to be labeled as this kind of this who just bears witness to this changes that's taking place. And I think Otobong Nkanga is also not just bearing witness, but at the same time, for me, what represents is that she's also a victim at the same time. She's also a beloved of her land, as someone who is beloved, and someone who is also a martyr, which I have to say, because I kind of feel that she's also giving up herself, like while exploring, while doing this kind of works. That's the main thing that, and then she kind of provide this alternative space or alternative culture that where we can sort of question and reposition what the entire idea of environmentalism is, especially in this 21st century, because we know how climate change has exceeded beyond our imagination. And that's what I feel that she has been doing in her work. And that's my answer. I hope that's one that you're looking for, but I'm not very sure that it's a good answer. Sorry for that.
Oh, please don't do that. I thought it was a great answer. Does anyone else have part of an answer or to give to that?
I think maybe just to add on to what Veronica says, and maybe providing a different texture, I think the understanding of the environmental is itself an imaginary that we need to unpack. So I think that the kind of expansiveness of Nkanga's practice is to go, in fact, beyond the kind of specific notions, ecologically sounded notions about environment within the context of environmentalism, or, you know, the kind of general greenscape that exists in a lot of contemporary discourse, you know, climate change, sustainability, environmentally conscious and friendly and whatnot. I think what Nkanga is so adept at doing and what she does very, very elegant is to kind of work with a larger vocabulary of what the environment really means, in terms of the physical containers and the physical spaces that she shows her work to the kind of larger social environment and media environments in which this work circulates, and the kind of different dynamics that she plums and she facilitates and she kind of encourage conversations within. I think those could also be potential framework to just understand the multiple dimensions of what environments are. And in so doing, I think that is also how she avoids being pigeonholed as, an artist who works explicitly with a very specific kind of environmentalist thematic. Because, I mean, if we want to really go down into it, like cultural production also generates an enormous amount of waste. Like, look at shipping container for paintings. Like, look at the kind of logistical infrastructure needed to move paintings. I think those are all factors that are embedded, this kind of latencies, this violence latencies of, what does it really mean to be concerned with the environment? I think these are just, layers of complexity to further consider.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, it's definitely worth noting that like there's a lot of like anthropocentrism like latent in sort of the ways we tend to think about like environmental practice. And of course, I mean, the deeper question of like, sort of the idea of environmental preservation coming from like these colonial roots, right? And like the game parks and stuff like that. But I mean, yeah, for sure. There's like, and going back almost to sort of like the difference in sort of being a self that questioner mentioned. There's this interesting bit that I think is kind of like layered under the performance I looked at, Contained Measures of a Kola Nut, where it's like in the Kola Nut veneration, the Kola Nut hospitality ritual, the understanding is that the Kola Nut is itself a guest, right? Like it's that the nut and sort of like by extension, sort of the family of trees that the nut represents, like, a particular person's grove, are present at the meal, right? Or at the meeting, and are sort of acting as mediators in a conversation, like they're actually present there. Like, and I mean, it's only through them that you can begin to sort of talk. And I mean, that sort of relationship to a plant, right, to the kola nut is so different from kind of like the custodial or stewardship relationship that we tend to have with plant life or just sort of the world around us in general, right? I mean, it's like I feel like a true meeting of selves, and sort of actually almost allowing to the plant to be a partner in like the co-creation of selves, right? And I just wanted to echo. I thought there was a lot there, Alphonse.
Yeah, no, really great. And I would gladly share a kola nut with any of you guys, and hope we can sometime together. This has been so wonderful, and I think this is a good place to wrap up. So I want to thank you so much for all this time that you've given and the thoughtful responses. And I really am looking forward to these finished essays that will be published in a compendium that's coming in 2025. It'll be available during the exhibition of Otobong Nkanga's work, and they'll also be available to the public during that time. So if you are watching today to receive this printed compendium, there is a link to fill out in the chat to get early access to it. So I want to say thank you to the Nasher Sculpture Center and the supporters of the Nasher Prize for making this week's programming possible, and also to all of you again who have tuned in. And finally, where would we be without the Nasher Prize winning artist Otobong Nkanga for inspiring all of this to occur?